Thank you very much, Marta. And now to the lecture proper. So I might have one reflection to begin with, which is that I'm never sure whether it's good for a country to get into the limelight of international attention, but it's certainly something that happened to Romania now. So in this lecture, we'll be looking at a country that suddenly grabbed a lot of interest and caused a lot of concern also for so many different reasons. And we have an excellent person with us to explain all that for us and to put it in a long historical perspective. So, Simina, thank you very much for accepting this invitation. And I am so very happy that we made this acquaintance during the Prague conference and that you are here to help us deal with the questions that we might have regarding the situation in Romania. So Simina Dragos is a research fellow at Queen's College in Cambridge, and she's currently finishing her PhD dissertation. And you have many interests, Simina, including sociology of race, political sociology, critical education study, but also, as you mentioned to me, during the Prague conference, memory studies used also to be one of your main fields. And Simina also co-directs the Catalyst for Decolonization Research Lab at the Center for Research in Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities at the University of Cambridge, and teaches undergraduate classes on eugenics, genocide, nationalism, and decolonial approaches to Europe. So many broad interests, and Romania in the middle of it all, at the intersection of it all. So, Simina, please take us there. The floor is yours now.
Thank you so much, Marta, for having me here. And thank you to Marta Gospodarczyk for organizing this talk. And thank you to all of you for being here. As Marta already said, I have many interests, but at the heart of my interest are education in Romania. So I'm a sociologist of education by training. And as you heard, I'm in the final stages of writing up my PhD research, as well as being now in my postdoctoral post, a little bit ahead of time. This presentation that I'm just going to share now is part of my new research. And can you see it? Yeah. And I am really honored to be able to present it here today and perhaps get some feedback on this ongoing work that I am making sense of. Nationalism has been the focus of my PhD research, and it's perhaps within nationalism studies that I sit more broadly and that I come from in this presentation. However, I'm trying to, like many other Romanians, speaking in personal capacity now, I'm trying to make sense of the political landscape in Romania, and the fact that Romania, as Marta rightfully put it, is in the limelight at the moment for not good reasons. And I'm trying to do so with the tools that sociology offers us, and particularly historical sociology offers us to make sense of politics. So today I'm going to begin with my broader critique of nationalism studies, if you will, then present my argument, present key empirical points to this case, which the case I will present, and then propose that a conjunctural analysis might be the kind of analysis that helps us understand why now. Why are we seeing the resurgence of the far right in Romania at this particular point in time? But, and this is where perhaps I'm being a bit overly ambitious, but let's see, I will also attempt to offer a geopolitical critique of what is going on, particularly looking at the power changes that are going on in the United States and how those affect Romania and the broader region of East Europe more broadly. So as a starting point, much of my work on nationalism studies has been positioned against the tropes of resurgence of nationalism, or neo-nationalism, as it's sometimes referred to in the literature. Since the election of Donald Trump and Brexit, in the context where I'm based in the United Kingdom, we have seen a variety of scholars and social commentators and politicians refer to a sort of rise in nationalism, so much so that a special issue of the British Sociological Association claimed in 2020 that nationalism is on the rise. But interestingly enough, important historical sociologist of nationalism, Anthony Smith, was referring to a resurgence of nationalism in 1996 already. So we have seen at different points in times nationalism being conceptualized as something that surges. I would argue that many of these arguments about resurgence or neo-nationalism are perhaps overemphasizing change and can end up being ahistorical at the detriment of understanding the very processes which produce nationalism and fascist violence more broadly. And the reason why I speak about nationalism and fascist violence in one breath is because I see nationalism and fascism as emerging from the same sort of inter-imperial relations in the 19th century, particularly. And I will historicize the emergence of Romanian nationalism as deeply embedded in the relationship between the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires in the 19th century, and more broadly as part of modernity coloniality. I also argue in my work, in my PhD work and elsewhere in published work, that racism is at the core of Romanian nationalism. And this has taken particularly the form of anti-Semitism, but also the form of anti-Roma racism. However, I think that even though I love historical analyses, which I do, I think it's really important to offer conjunctural analysis, which help us understand how hegemony forms and shifts over time and what makes this particular crisis possible. So when does nationalism actually turn into fascism? Because not all nationalism is always fascist. My overarching argument then in this presentation will be that under specific conjunctures, which are local and global, nationalism can turn into fascism because they are both formations of modernity coloniality. So because they come from the same suprastructure, if you will, and many of you will have now understood that I am a materialist at my core, but we can get into that a little bit later as well. And my hope is to put the local in conversation with the global to make sense of why and when shifts in power relations are incumbent. But ultimately, my argument will be that the competition and aggression between imperial formations, so not just traditional empires, imperial formations, can result in power shifts at the local level as well, so not just regionally or globally. So what is the issue that I'm talking about? So I am specifically talking about the current destabilization of Romania, which comes out of the annulation of the presidential election of 2024, which you might have seen in the news. The first election round was on the 24th of November 2024, and many liberals were fearing, myself included, that George Simion, the leader of the populist far-right, our party, would be the favored candidate. That was sort of my worst case scenario. But we had a turn of events for the worse in the sense that another candidate, which no one saw coming, called Călin Georgescu, who was on the ballot as independent and seemed, you know, kind of like out of nowhere, ended up winning the majority of the votes, which was 22.94% of the votes, or 2 million votes in total. And he was, importantly, the preferred candidate in the diaspora, where I live, of course, where he managed to gather 43.35% of the vote. Importantly, he declared zero campaign expenses, and this will be an important reference point in a few moments. But long story short, the Constitutional Court of Romania annulled the election results on the 6th of December 2024, and this is where the chaos sort of started. These are the election results on the left-hand side domestically, and on the right-hand side in the diaspora. And so we see that the top two candidates are Călin Georgescu on the one hand, who represents a sort of what is now referred to as a sovereignist bloc, so an anti-Western, anti-NATO, anti-EU bloc, and Elena Valerica Lasconi, who was representative of the party in opposition, or a party that has been constituted as a party of opposition, called the Union Save Romania, which broadly represents, in my opinion, the corporate class and a sort of technocratic approach to governance. So who is this Călin Georgescu that no one saw coming? These are some of the things that he stands for and declared publicly. On the one hand, he declared that Ukraine is a fake state, and he declares himself to be a pro-peace candidate for Ukraine, and we have seen what that means with Donald Trump. He is a proponent of revisionism in the sense that he proposes a historical expansionism, stating that Romania's territories has been sold off. By this, he means Moldova and the Second World War context in which Moldova became occupied by the Soviet Union, but other territories in the region as well. He is against corporations broadly defined, for example, the use of supermarkets, and he is anti-vax, as many populist leaders nowadays are. I've already said that he is anti-West more broadly, and he's also engages in Holocaust denial, as well as, and this is what I find kind of fascinating about him, he is very esoteric. He's a very esoteric figure in the sense that he's ultra-Orthodox, but not just Orthodox. He draws on these spiritual references related to nature and water and divine spirit and so on and so forth. He presents himself, like many populists do, as anti-establishment and frequently attacks the political and intelligence establishment as a way of proving that he is they have nothing on him. He's classically populist in the way he uses social media, and social media has been key to his rise. But he also engages in very fascist aesthetic and promotes the importance of traditional masculinity achieved via sport and family values and religion. And as I've already mentioned, he represents a broader bloc that is forming in Romanian politics and has been for a while now, which is described both locally and elsewhere as sovereignist in the sense of protecting the sovereignty of the Romanian people, racially defined. I've put this image here to, of course, on the right-hand side is President Putin, and on the left-hand side is presidential candidate Călin Georgescu. And I've put here this image because on the one hand, it's kind of funny, but on the other hand, it also shows the kind of aesthetic registers that he draws upon in promoting his persona. So the question is, to what extent is Călin Georgescu actually outside of the establishment? Like, who is he? Is he really coming out of nowhere? One interesting fact is that his bodyguards and many people who support him are members of the Foreign Legion. And one of his key supporters, who I have come to understand has just been arrested and has been prosecuted for a while, is a sort of, I don't know whether to call it a senior figure or leader in mercenary warfare in Africa. He is associated with a local variation of the Club of Rome, which is a sort of an elite network interested in the issues of tackling the issues of humanity. That's how they describe themselves. And as part of that elite network within Romania, he's been associated with other ultranationalist and far-right political and cultural figures. He's performed intelligence missions abroad before 1989, so he was an intelligence agent under the state socialist regime. And he had several government roles and then roles in the United Nations as well in the 1990s and early 2000s. And this is something the press loves reporting on. He's lived in Vienna for several years, and we don't know what he did to afford that. So there you go. That's a question for you. And some I have seen in the press vehiculated the argument that he could potentially be an external intelligence agent, or could have been an external intelligence agent after 1989 too, or at least in that initial transitionary period. Okay, but what actually happened to get this man to not be elected as president of Romania? So one day after the first round of election on the 25th of November 2024, pro-democracy protests started in the country, across the country, Bucharest as well, primarily led by student groups and young people who were sort of invoking the trope of not wanting to be in the Russian sphere of influence. 2 days later, two presidential candidates request that the Constitutional Court of Romania cancel the election result on the argument that the election was not constitutional. A day later, the judges of the Constitutional Court decide the recounting of the votes from the first round of election, which is a slightly insane decision. On the same day, the president at the time, Klaus Johannes, calls the Supreme Council of Defense of the country to the presidential palace, citing potential cyber threats from state and non-state actors to the electoral infrastructure and also more generally national security. Yet a few days later, the Constitutional Court validates the first election round and say, actually, no, it was constitutional and the counting was done fairly. And so the second round of voting should go ahead as planned. But the key turning point is the 4th of December, 2024. So 4 days before the second round of elections is planned, when the acting president, Klaus Johannes, declassifies the reports put forward by intelligence services as part of the Supreme Council of Defense of the country. And as part of these reports, several allegations and claims were made around how this Călin Georgescu manages to grab such a large share of the votes and, you know, really the imagination of the Romanian voting public. So I'm not going to go into all of the details because it can get quite technical. But what I want you to understand from this report is that he managed to win such a large share of the vote through a concerted social media campaign, primarily on China-based TikTok, where there were 25,000 accounts which were coordinating, not bot farms, accounts which were coordinating hashtags and content to promote Călin Georgescu in insidious ways. So not necessarily by saying Călin Georgescu is the best, but by promoting a series of different hashtags and political content. The reports also found that Telegram and Discord were used to share information on how to avoid getting banned by TikTok and how to avoid the content being marked as political or as electoral information, but rather just being marked as entertainment. And TikTok eventually agrees that 1 million euros were spent in the pro-Georgescu campaign, out of which 380,000 US dollars were paid to TikTok account by this particular actor, which I'm going to get to in a second, meaning that on the one hand, Călin Georgescu had lied about having zero campaign expenses, and on the other hand, there were serious money being pumped into making sure that he gets elected. At the heart of how this money made it to TikTok accounts is a figure called Bogdan Peșchir, who is broadly or simply defined a crypto bro. So someone who is engaged in cryptocurrency and is very keen on being anonymous, but apparently routinely donates money to TikTok accounts. He is an associate of a bigger fish, though, called Gabriel Prodanescu, who holds South African citizenship and has a cryptocurrency in the UK. So now we're already starting to get sense of the sort of global dimension of the flow of money on this, particularly because a South African-based firm was used to pay these influencer accounts, these Romanian influencer accounts, money to promote Călin Georgescu-related content. The reports of the state intelligence also found that various leaders of mercenary groups and far-right actors, let's put it that way, more broadly, who were known to the intelligence services, were involved in promoting the Georgescu campaign and supported him. And the reports mentioned several times that the state actor needs to have been involved because of the geographical magnitude of the operation and because of the amount of money involved. So they sort of conclude that it's probably Russia who's done all of this. And the external intelligence service states really clearly, and I quote, Romania is a target for aggressive hybrid Russian actions, including cyber attacks and information leaks and sabotages. So as a result of this, the next day, the 5th of December, two academic institutions, a publication and a presidential candidate asked the Supreme Court, or the Constitutional Court, we don't have the Supreme Court, to cancel the result of the election as a result of the reports. And on the 6th of December, indeed, the Constitutional Court decides that the second round of election are canceled based on information released from these declassified reports. So we are in a situation where we don't have an election. The president continues to be the Klaus Johannes, even though that is he should have ended his office. And from December into the present, there have been several protests against the cancellation of elections and in support of Călin Georgescu, supported also broadly by other populist far-right parties, which were the ones that we thought might win, but weren't as successful as Călin Georgescu. Excuse me. And so we see the coagulation of a broader coalition of the far right emerging in this period of time. Just yesterday, a new opinion poll found that support for Călin Georgescu grew from 14% at the time of the election in November to 31% in the capital of Bucharest. And the candidate proposed by the alliance of mainstream parties is only at 24%. And formerly second favorite candidate, Elena Lasconi, is only at 10%. So we're now going to have the election in May. And we are looking at a steep growth for Călin Georgescu in this present moment. And just before I connected to this call, I saw online that Călin Georgescu has been arrested by prosecutors, and this saga continues. So as a sociologist, of course, I'm interested in the detail, but I'm interested in why this happened. And what is this all about? How can we make sense of what's going on here? I make a few proposals for those of us interested in the situation in Romania at the moment. And I would argue that focusing on the absurdity of Georgescu as a person and his esotericism, all his stupid claims, is a waste of time. I don't think that's what we should be spending our time on. I also think that blaming everything on Russian interests or Russia is simplistic and actually doesn't have as much analytical purchase as it could have. And I also don't want to put everything down to a global resurgence of the right. That's true, there is a resurgence of the right globally, but I think that's an incomplete account of what's going on in this particular context. So what do I propose? Drawing on Stuart Hall, and particularly Stuart Hall's book, Policing the Crisis, I'm interested in how a conjunctural analysis can help us make sense of what is going on in Romania at the present. Conjunctural analysis is put forward by Stuart Hall in the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies, drawing on Althusser and Gramsci, to describe how moments of unrest in capitalism, they say there are moments of relative stability and moments of unrest. And those moments of unrest are moments when antagonism and contradictions inherent in capitalism fuse into a, quote, ruptural unity. So that is a conjuncture for Stuart Hall. Conjunctures are really important moments because they can lead to the structure being reinvented or rearticulated, or challenged even, dismantled. But it's ultimately about a change in hegemony. And this concept of hegemony has been one that I've been fascinated with for a while. And I write, this is a separate it's a kind of tangent, but I write about nationalism as a hegemonic project, which I would be happy to talk about in a Q&A. More broadly, a conjuncture has economic, cultural, political, social aspects that reflect the crisis of capitalism at a given point in time. And it's not about a longue durée approach. So it's not about looking at the very, very long period of time. It's not about looking at a very specific moment, just this election, but about looking at convergent and divergent tendencies which shape the totality of power relation within a given social field during a particular period of time. So this is all rather perhaps abstract at this point in time, but I'm not going to go over this quotation because I don't want to run out of time. But let's do it more concrete, talking about Romania. So I would say that the present conjuncture in Romania, which reflects a deep crisis of capitalism, has started around 2007, which marks Romania's integration in the European Union. And of course, the 2008 financial crisis is very important as well. So I think the election of a person like Georgescu has been a long time coming for a few empirical reasons. So on the one hand, I'm really concerned with the scale of immigration out of the country and the fragmentation of social units, so families, communities, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, increased austerity and a smaller welfare state. Deindustrialization is a very big part of this as well. There is increased inequality and generalized poverty in Romania. So we could say there's a lack of a middle class. But there is also a profound lack of parties that address the concerns of working people. And the opposition is primarily expressing itself in technocratic terms that don't necessarily connect with the realities of the rural poor. I also think part of the conjuncture is the corruption and lack of trust in institutions, and the fact that hegemony after 1989 has been held by this bloc of PSD-PNL, which are the two main centrist-ish parties, who have held electoral and social hegemony through nepotism and cronyism, as well as just more broader corruption in various aspects of social life. And also we see a trend to the right in parliamentary election, and I've put here the results of December's parliamentary election as well in Romania. So in the diaspora, the absolute top is the Alliance for the Union of Romanians, which is the far-right party. And other two parties in the top four parties are also far-right, and particularly sovereignist far-right, so racial far-right. Even as domestically, the hegemonic PSD still manages to gain a very large share of the vote. We see that in the diaspora, especially. So those people who have been cut off from their communities and their families due to economic precarity are done with the status quo. This is a really important, in my view, reflection of how the COVID pandemic changed the trust in institutions in Romania, particularly the very, very small percentage of trust in the government. So only 14.1% of respondents shared that they trust the Romanian government, and only 17.3% trusting the Romanian presidency, and less than half of the respondents trusted the European Union or NATO. I think this is really important to bear in mind as a change that was brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic and the multiple social, economic, and political crises ensuing from that. And I also wanted to give you a brief sense of the sort of austerity and precarity that I'm talking about. So on the left, you can see the resident population in Romania at the 1st of January. And you see, like, honestly, a very, very steep decline in population numbers, even though we're only talking about 2 million people. 2 million adults mostly is a lot of people to leave a country in the span of 15 years. And then when we're talking about markers of socioeconomic well-being, you can see that the percentage of household spending on food and non-alcoholic drinks in Romania is one of the highest of the European Union, as well as the number of people at risk of poverty or social exclusion being at nearly 35%. Same with early school leavers being a much higher than average percentage, and also a low GDP per capita, even though the highest GDP per capita in the region of Southeast Europe. But in my view, this is only half of the story. And the local conjuncture is very important, which I've just described you, but I think there are aspects of the global conjuncture that we should take into account when thinking about Romania. I've put here a timeline, not because I'm a historical sociologist and I love dates, but because I want to give you a sense of the rapidity, the scale and velocity of change that is going on around this particular issue. So of course, on the 20th of January, 2025, Donald Trump takes office and marks a broader change in the constitutional order of the United States, which of course affects the rest of the world, but also marks a change, I would argue, in the hegemony of the West that has been a long time coming. But Donald Trump is sort of a figure for that. Before Donald Trump takes office, Musk tweets, Elon Musk, Donald Trump's right-hand man, tweets, "From MAGA to MEGA, make Europe great again," as part of his ongoing support of Alice Weidel in the AfD. And Musk ends up being beamed in at an AfD rally this month in February. And importantly, for the case of Romania, Trump has a phone call with Putin on the 12th of February 2025, resulting into US-Russia talks in Saudi Arabia on the 18th of February 2025, which we all know how they ended, or perhaps some of you don't, but basically they decided to exclude Ukraine from these quote-unquote peace talks, and it looks like some deals that are unfavorable to Ukraine will need to be struck for the deadly war to end. The reason why I put here Musk's interest in the AfD and in Europe more broadly is because a month after Musk tweets from MAGA to MEGA, make Europe great again, Musk tweets Romania deserves its own sovereignty in response to Călin Georgescu's claim that he will ban the entire Soros network on his first day in office. On the same day, the Trump administration asks Romania to relax travel restrictions on the Tate brothers, who are far-right influencers, misogynistic far-right influencers. And a day later, Bloomberg reports that the Trump administration pressures Romania not to prevent Călin Georgescu from running in the May presidential election, so presuming that Romania will try and prevent him from running the election. But the Romanian Ministry of Affairs denies this. Again, a day later, so again happening very quickly, J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference accuses the Romanian Constitutional Court for canceling the election because they didn't like the result. And on the same day, Musk calls one of the Romanian Constitutional Court judges a tyrant, not a judge. So we see a variety of far-right actors from the United States taking huge interest in Romania as part of their broader interest on the far right in Europe, but also as part of their reimagined relationship with the Russian Federation. But is the popularity of Georgescu just a local expression of a crisis of the West? Or is it part of a broader shift in global hegemony? How are we to make sense of this? And I want to make a few proposals here. I think this conjuncture and any conjuncture doesn't come out of nowhere. I think the longue durée is really important to be understood as an underlying current of the conjuncture, even as the conjuncture is not itself a longue durée moment. And I think two points are really important here. Firstly, nationalism in Romania emerged out of inter-imperial competition in the 19th century. And secondly, European fascism can be understood as an extension of European colonialism, as it has been understood by thinkers such as Hannah Arendt or Frantz Fanon or Aimé Césaire. And I've also put here a reference to Du Bois, the American sociologist, the African-American sociologist, who thought about the First World War as resulting from the Berlin Conference of the 19th century, rather than out of inter-imperial competition, rather than internal pressures within Europe. So I want to argue that the global conjuncture enables the local conjuncture to exist. And to do so, I draw on a broader paradigm of global historical sociology, which positions that we should understand the global and transnational constitution of national forms. So how is nationalist violence constitutional on a transnational scale is my question then. So what about the transnational enables the constitution, the enactment of violence in the local? And to do this, I position my work more broadly in the decolonial school of thought and think about modernity as the paradigm which produces violence through nationalism, much in the tradition of the Frankfurt School, for example, but with a slightly different take. So the decolonial school positions that modernity cannot be understood without coloniality, and that the developments of European modernity within Europe, so industrialization, enlightenment, the rise of the nation state, and so on and so forth, cannot be decoupled for the global conditions which made it possible, those being the transatlantic trade in enslaved humans and the extraction of resources from the colonies. And following this line of thought, I argue in a paper that came out last year that nationalism is a form of coloniality precisely because it relies on boundary making that are racial in nature. And I argue that those boundary making between the national and the non-national are drawing on broader boundaries that are made between Europeanness and non-Europeanness in modernity. So this is why I say that nationalism is not a matter of revival, but it's a matter of endurance in the longue durée. So here just a few broad, quickly just a few historical reference points. This is not the first time Romania has a fascist running in the presidential election post-1989. There were many far-right candidates running in Romanian elections post-1989, including making it to the final two, so the second round of the electoral stage, with Vadim Tudor a few times. Plus, Romania had a fascist government in the interwar year and was a Nazi ally in the Second World War, as well as committing genocidal acts against Jewish and Roma people, and then had a very repressive totalitarian national communism, which had a strongly nationalistic base rather than having a base of internationalism, as the Soviet Union proclaimed to have. Importantly, the first ever constitution that Romania had as a state limited property ownership to Christians precisely as a way of keeping Jewish people away from property ownership and capital, and because the logic of capital was seen as intertwined with the logic of the Romanian national, but Jewish people were not imagined as part of the Romanian national community, and neither were Roma. And so I want to highlight this element of constitution of Romanian nationalism through the competition between different empires, to say there is something imperial about how nationalism acts, even when it acts at a local level, not least because in order to be able to self-determine and to be able to call themselves a nation state, Romanian nationalists felt that they had to demonstrate their Euro-whiteness, right? They had to demonstrate that they were European, that they had a European descent, and they drew particularly on associations with the Roman Empire to do so, right? The state is called Romania. Because at that time, to be Euro-white, to be European, meant to have a stake in global hegemony. So I think the reason why Romanian nationalism is articulated as racial nationalism cannot be decoupled from the fact that at the moment of its emergence, Euro-whiteness was hegemonic on a global scale, and having rights was associated with being European in the frame of the global European empires. So, put it in relation to what I've just told you about Romanian nationalism, I want to bring the arguments of anti-colonial thinkers from the 20th centuries who thought about events within Europe and the world wars as happening as a result of imperial activity. So, for example, as I've just mentioned, W.E.B. Du Bois thought of the World War as growing out of the competition between European empires for the colonies. And Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon thought of European fascism emerging out of European colonialism and saw the fight against fascism and the fight against colonialism being the same struggle, particularly because they saw colonialism as being reflected back onto the metropole through fascism. And this is, of course, what Hannah Arendt meant by her boomerang effect. So my speculation, and this is where I'm going to end and open it up for discussion, is that we are experiencing currently the destabilization of global hegemony of the USA-EU bloc, and that a new conjuncture is upon us, and thus a new potential hegemony. And the reason why I'm saying this is because there is a very noticeably different approach in the way the United States approaches Russia. And I think we're looking once again, as we were looking in the 19th century, as at a moment of intense inter-imperial activity. Of course, the US, China, Russia, and the European Union are not 19th century empires, but they are imperial formations of a certain kind. And I think the competition between these imperial formations is played out via the war in Ukraine, which unfortunately I think is a proxy war. And I do wonder whether Romania is now also becoming part of the same proxy. And why would Romania become part of the same proxy? Well, because it's the EU lead in gas production, for one, because the Romanian Navy is the biggest NATO fleet in the Black Sea, because the Romanian army is the 7th largest in the EU, and because the Romanian population is the 6th largest in the EU. And as I've already mentioned, Romania has the highest GDP in the region of Southeast Europe. And of course, Romania is a key transit area for delivering armaments to Ukraine. And so just briefly to finish, I think global historical sociology can help us understand what the global and historical factors are that make both local and global conjunctures possible, which bring fascist violence back to the rise. Of course, there are important differences, one of them being the hybrid warfare that is perpetuated through cyber attacks and so on and so forth, and the role of social media in influencing elections. But on the other hand, I think we need to keep our eye on the global flows of capital, which make this kind of promotion of fascist leaders possible, and also on the competition between different imperial formations for power and how that might change the world order as we know it. Thank you very much.